Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. Welcome to yet another episode of the EQ Lunch and Learn series brought to you by PTS Africa. My name is Mucha Mlingo and I am your host for this important conversation. As I always say, today we will bring the learning. I hope you have provided the lunch. Welcome to this conversation. This is a conversation in line with the theme for International Women's Day this month of March, embracing equity. And as always, I have a great panel that are going to help me to unpack the idea of what equity is. For International Women's Day and beyond, let's fully embrace equity. Equity isn't just a nice to have, it is a must have. A focus on gender equity needs to be part of every society's DNA. It's critical to understand the difference between equity and equality. Equality means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. Equity, however, recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. But what does emotional intelligence have to do with equality and equity, you may be wondering? Well, emotions are inextricably connected to our decision making, how we communicate with others, and how we interpret the world around us. Emotions also contribute to our subconscious biases towards ourselves and others. So we need to pay attention to our emotions, and that will enable us to ensure equality and equity. Today, we're exploring how companies can break down barriers for women to move into leadership roles, how we can work towards inclusion, and the impact that this has in the workplace. And we're talking, of course, about how emotional intelligence can power this journey towards greater equity. I have two amazing guests with me today, and they're going to help me to dig deeper to understand our topic for today. So, allow me to introduce my guests as I bring them on stage. I have with me today Benjamin. Benjamin Rukwenje founded Uganda's leading human capital development enterprise, focusing on work readiness and entrepreneurship skilling and mentorship. Boundless Minds, through its premier digital platform, The Mentor, is creating opportunities for career development, career advancement, and school to work transition for thousands across Africa. Benjamin, you are welcome today. Looking forward to the conversation that we will have. You could say hi to us all.
Hello, hi Mucha, and hi everyone. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Benjamin. If you'd like to connect more with Benjamin, you can connect with him on LinkedIn. I'm sure you will want to get to know him a little better after he has dropped his knowledge that I know he will drop today. I also have with me Sheila Burgeon. Sheila is the country lead for Innovate UK, KTN Global Alliance Africa. She is an ecosystem builder and convener with 13 years' experience in supporting startups, building innovation ecosystems, and convening stakeholders in the tech industry across Africa. She is the former entrepreneurship director at iHub and the managing director of Founders Institute Kenya. She has mentored and worked with over 1,000 entrepreneurs across the continent. She was named by Root Magazine among the top 6 Black women in leading the charge to grow the technology sector across the African continent. We're really happy to have Sheila with us today. Sheila, you are very welcome today. Looking forward to the conversation that we are going to have.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Sheila. If you want to connect more with Sheila as well, you can connect with her on LinkedIn. So let's dive into our conversation. As I always tell my panelists, our conversation today is a conversation amongst friends. And the idea is for us to just unpack a little this idea of embracing equity and what it means for all of us. Sheila, let me start with you. In your own words, and perhaps using a personal experience, can you briefly describe the difference between equity and equality, and why equity is required for the success of equality? Sheila, you're muted.
I don't know why I keep muting myself, and I knew I was going to I'm just alone in the office.
No worries.
Sorry about that. I think that's a very, very good question, and I think I'll give you an example of equity and equality. So, um, in Kenya, all of us go through the same education system, right? If you go to a private school, if you go to a public school, we kind of go through the same curriculum, all of us. But there are kids who end up finishing school because schools are deliberate around ensuring that they have all the right resources, the teachers, they make sure the time that they spent in school, they are able to finish the curriculum in time. And then there are those kids who, they have to go home for because of school fees. They don't have books. They don't have, they just don't have, right? So in terms of equity, you'll see, or equality, all of us are equal in that sense. We are going through the same curriculum, right? But in terms of equity, it's not equitable. If I miss class for a week and I come back because, maybe my mom was able to sell chicken for me to get a few coins for me to come back to school, the education system was still continuing whether I was home or not. And so for those kids who are still in school, they would have benefited more. For schools that have structures that allow parents to students to have extra classes maybe in the evenings, for parents who can afford tuition for their kids, for parents who can be able to pay school fees, they keep bringing that um, part up, and that is what equity then is meant to create. Equity is meant to create platforms to allow everybody to have equal platform and vision of what is going on. So in terms of education, if all of us were getting the same treatment, same opportunities, same teachers, which is sometimes impossible, then that would be in that case. And I'll give you an example now, personal experience I mentioned. So I come from the village, grew up in the village all my life, until when I came to uni. And for me, what I would see in our village was not something I wanted. So I didn't have a career ambition when I was young. I just wanted to leave the village. That was it. People wanted to be doctors, teachers. No, I just wanted to leave the village. Where to? I just needed to leave the village, right? And for me, that was the only big dream. Like, to me, that was such a big deal. To leave our village was such a big deal for anyone, because nobody used to leave our village anyway. And so every time I've been exposed, my eyes have constantly been opened to opportunities, to people, to things that I've seen that limited vision I had, which was still fine for all the people in my village. It's still a big dream, still something major to live there. But every time education has elevated me, work has elevated me, traveling has elevated me, the reach of the things I see now and want to achieve now is completely different from that girl who was in the village. And I think equity, even you see, for the villagers, for instance, even all of us having the same opportunities and resources and that limited, it's just that fate and maybe a few opportunities were able to open my eyes to other things that then now I have access to, that I feel they don't, because they don't have the same vision that I have at the moment. So I would say it plays a critical role even in careers. Like, we'll talk about biases I think at some point, but it just plays a critical role in ensuring that everybody within a career gap grows, or feels like they have an opportunity to grow in the same way as everybody else. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience. I like what you said that you just needed to leave the village. You know, that was your aspiration, and that fueled you and pushed you to achieve. I like the comments you shared. Let me allow Benjamin to share the same to respond to the same question, and then I'll also share some thoughts on my own. So, Benjamin, in your own thoughts, and possibly using a personal experience, what do you feel is the difference between equity and equality? And why is equity important?
Thank you. So there's an image, an illustrator that I usually see online, uh, clearly illustrating the difference between equity and equality. I don't know if anyone has seen it. It
Mm,
well, it goes between explaining reality, equality, equity, and liberation, right? So it has these three individuals, one of whom, is disabled, standing behind a fence with where each one of the so the reality is that one of them, who's usually able-bodied and stuff, has a stack of crates on which they are standing, so their visibility is is a lot higher. Then there's another one who has just one crate, and one who's just standing. So that's the reality of life, that there are people who have usually a lot more than others. Then it comes to and are able to get ahead of everyone else because of their access and privilege and stuff like that, and that we see every day. Then when it comes to equality, they say, okay, now everyone will have one stack of crates on which to stand, so everyone is equal. But you forget that if someone is, for example, unable to walk or stand, and another person is able to have the full use of their limbs, it's different when you give them, if you give them the same platform, it won't work that way. So what equity is to say, look, I recognize that your contexts are different, right? So how you access resources, where you access them from, how you're able to use them is totally different. So I will allocate these resources and opportunities based on your actual context. And to use an example of, for example, our work, so we have a digital platform that enables students to access work readiness training, right? So they can go on there, access all of these work readiness modules, and the resources and opportunities and all of this stuff online. So that's, we are basically say we are creating opportunities for young people to access work readiness skilling. The thing is, so that's what equality is, right? But that platform in itself is not equitable, right? It's not equitable because it assumes that everyone has access to the internet, right? Or has access to a smartphone, or knows how to use these tools, which, in all honesty, isn't the reality, right? So recognizing that allows for us to say, okay, look, we know that there are people who do not have access to these tools. So even while we've created a blanket uh, point of access for everyone, we will have to go, you know, over and beyond to provide access for people uh, to create tools that people who have no access to the internet can use, right? People who don't know how to use, who are not digitally literate, can use. So that's how then you create equity, right? Because you recognize this. So the platform itself is an equality, but if you go into the numbers, you realize that there are, like women have less access to digital tools. So if you are looking at it as in terms of equity, you realize that most of the people you have on the platform are men, and the reason why they are men is because they have a lot more access to digital tools, they have a lot more access to money, they have a lot more access to the internet, they have a lot more access. Their use of the internet is in terms of research is a lot more. They're a lot more digitally literate because of how they interact with the rest of the world compared to, say, uh, women who might not have these tools or these resources, or who might, because of systemic injustices, might not have this access. So then how do you go about designing tools that ensure that it's not just equality that you're pushing, but there's equitable access?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really how I would put it.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Benjamin. And I think that I like the example you've utilized, where you're talking about a platform and thinking about all those who would, as you've said, historically not be able to access that platform, and thinking about how to make that access equitable so that so that no one's left behind. I think that's great. Sheila, if I come back to you, what would you say is the most difficult parts of implementing equity in an organization? So we've talked about what equity is. We've agreed that equity is about assessing those who previously may be disadvantaged. It's about assessing everyone and making sure that they have what they need. Sometimes it may even be extra. So using the illustration you gave, Benjamin, where you're talking about the crates, perhaps one individual may need 3 crates to be able to see over the wall, as opposed to another who needs 1. So we understand what equity is. Why, or what would you say is the most difficult parts of implementing this in an organization, making sure that everyone is able to fully participate?
Well, I think first of all, it's a complex issue, especially if we look at the context we live in the continent. It's a complex issue because of structures that have been there for a very long time that we are used to, and this is something that is very new. It's being deliberate in ensuring that you provide equitable resources and opportunities to everybody within an organization. So there's complexities there. I would say resistance because of that, the culture that we're used to, resistance to this new change, and it's just innately in us that we have biases based on the environment that we've grown up in, and sometimes we don't resist change because we don't want it, but it's just because it's foreign to us. So there's that resistance, which is always a big challenge. There's, of course, we don't have enough data. So sometimes trying to ensure that we provide those opportunities for everybody else becomes difficult, because how do we justify it? We don't have the data we would require to allow us to be able to say, okay, we can back this up. And so we need to build critical data first for us to be able to do that. Then that data can allow us to create awareness or understanding of why implementing this is important internally. I think something else that is a big issue. I'll try to be very brief on this. Is
It's
on
okay.
okay. It's on the resources that we've put in place specifically for this. It took me working for an international organization to understand how people are deliberate around creating, understanding, and putting structures in place for equity to be implemented in organizations. There are trainings on biases that we take, their behavioral understanding, their cultural understanding training, their diversity trainings that we have to go through. Even in hiring processes and hiring managers, we have to be able to understand that there are these specific constraints that people might have that might limit them to even participate in interviews. We have people who have neurodivergent challenges, people who get so nervous, they panic, they can't speak. It doesn't mean that they are not good enough. It's just that the interviewing process is not ideal for them. But it doesn't mean that we can't provide an environment for these people to still feel comfortable enough. Maybe share questions beforehand, ask them if they're okay, conduct the interviews in phases so that it's a bit conducive for them, or just understanding where they are coming from. We don't have
Mm,
those, unfortunately, in most organizations in the continent. And so, because of that, it becomes a big challenge for the structures to be changed to be able to provide an environment that is conducive for equity to thrive internally, but also when you're bringing people in. So, those are some of the challenges. I would just say the biggest one is resistance because of our cultural and
mm,
upbringing. Um,
mm,
I think with the younger generation, there's more exposure now with the internet. They interact with a little bit more people, so they're more receptive to that. And like for most of us, it's always an issue how these people react and things like that. So that is the biggest barrier to implementing such challenges. Because if as a leader I don't find it important, how do you change my perception to ensure that I make all these other changes for it to happen in the organization? Yeah.
wow, wow. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sheila. I think that's a really great observation you've made. And indeed, I agree with you that our culture and background has such a big part to play in our ability to implement equity within our organizations. Often, our resistance to change is because of that socialization. So, thank you very much for sharing that. Benjamin, I could see you nodding along as Sheila was sharing. You can feel free to comment on the same question if you do have any contributions that you'd like to share. But in addition to that, what do you feel should be the main driver for establishing a diverse and inclusive culture? I mean, is it something that should just be about personal values, or is this something that should be a business concern? So feel free, like I said, if you want to add to or contribute to the question I'd asked Sheila, but above that, what should be the main driver in establishing a diverse and inclusive culture?
I mean, I agree with Sheila that our culture is probably the biggest contributor, because the I think that first, and I don't know how to put this without it coming off wrong, but I think that first, that there's no that e- the- that equality in itself is not wrong, right?
Mm,
That striving for equality is not wrong, but that equity is even more desirable. So, in that regard, um, that the first step is to achieve, is to try and achieve equality, in especially in places where, like this continent, or even in the world, depending on the context, where it doesn't already exist, uh, and then move from the conversation around equality to achieving equity. So that's the first thing. But the thing about diverse and inclusive culture is also that it's not. I think it can be both. I think that it can be both, because different people will approach, or have the understanding of it, from their own perspective and context, right? So if you think about it from, like a business perspective, right, that allowing for equity brings in a lot more diversity into the business and into the space, right? So you have a lot more voices, a lot more people on the table, a lot more solutions, a lot more the diversity of the range is expanded. The talent that you're able to attract, the talent that you're able to pull, um, how how productive they can be, and stuff like that is a lot more. If you think about it from a business perspective, so if you're thinking about it as a purely as a business decision, it makes sense, right? But if you're thinking about it from an individual perspective, it's to also understand that there's a certain uniqueness, right, to each one of us, which allows for us to introspect, right, and realize that I have advantages and privileges that other people don't have, right, which then makes it necessary for me to sort of level the ground for them. So, like how they say that privilege comes with responsibility, right? So, even at a personal level, when you think about how to achieve, diversity and inclusiveness, you realize that in the way that we think at a personal level, there's really advantages whether you approach it as an individual in terms of how much you can achieve in your own social networks and progress, but also as a business, how much you can achieve, how far you can go by simply opening up and not being closed in terms of this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it, this is how we've always done it, because you lock out so many views that would be great for you as a person in your own advancement, or would be useful for the business. So I'd say my take would be that it's both. I'd go with them. I don't think that
Yeah.
it's mutually exclusive, because it
Right.
isn't. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not an either or, it's an and, right?
Yes.
It's something that should be approached both from a business perspective, as you've said. And I like what you said that, when you do not diversify, you're locking out a different perspective, you're locking out different ideas, you're locking out different talent that ultimately will drive business success. And so it's for the benefit of the business to ensure that there is greater diversity and inclusion. But even as an individual, what I'm hearing you say, Benjamin, is that as an individual, for your own development as a person, it's critically important to be open to different individuals of different cultures, of different gender, different age, perhaps, because that also grows and sharpens you as an individual. And so, the idea is it should be something that we tackle as an organization. And to Sheila's earlier point, organizations then need to look critically at what can be done to ensure that the conversation about diversity and inclusion is one that is ongoing.
And just to say,
Yes,
and maybe I
yes,
should
yes,
add
please.
that when you think about, for example, like that aspect of human-centered design, right?
Mhm.
If you think about that concept, it says that for many of us who are doing, whether it's development work or outright entrepreneurship and business setup and stuff like that, that
Mhm.
you need to have different people in the room designing these programs, because how they interact with them, how they interact with your service, how they interact with your product, how they interact with you is based on their context and not yours, right?
Yeah.
So if you know think about programs or businesses that succeed or the ones that fail, part of it has to do with implementation, but a lot of it also has to do with the design, right? And the fact that that design was closed off. Classic example is where a couple of years ago, we set up this charity organization. We were students, we were fresh graduates, fresh out of university and stuff, and set up this organization that was supporting literacy, in slums and orphanages and stuff like that. But none of us had ever lived there. None of us, in fact, all of us were from, what you'd call privileged background, if you like. So we had all of these ideas about how things should work that we sought to, supplant onto how the program should work for the beneficiaries, right? It was a disaster. It was really disastrous in terms of the working relationship, because we couldn't understand why they couldn't see that what we were doing was for their own good, and why they were very resistant to it. It didn't. So if you were doing like a monitoring and evaluation of that process, it was disastrous. But we were young. When we got older and started to think about it, it made sense for us to think, okay, now it makes sense because you're able to think and design this differently. If we were doing this again, they would design the intervention, right? They would be in the room because they are the ones who interact with these problems every day, and we don't. And I think that's what sort of the equality to say, okay, we need children from vulnerable background to access education is sort of different from saying, but we need for them and their parents to think about how this program should be designed. Now that makes it equitable because it will allow for contextual access. Yeah.
I like that point. I think that's really important. And yet all too often in teams, in organizations, we aren't leveraging the skill set of a more diverse group to ensure that the product that we ultimately end up with is one that is useful to a diverse group. I really love the illustration you've given that the end user, as much as is possible, should be part of the solution finding for something to be more effective. Thank you very much for sharing. Sheila, I want to come to you and just ask a question. What criteria can be used to measure success in building a diverse workforce? So we've talked about, what could be some of the challenges in implementing equity. Benjamin has shared the driver, that it should be both an organization issue and an individual issue. What criteria can we use to measure how successful we are in building a diverse workforce?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. I think first thing is, for you to measure, you have to have put the right I don't know, you've put the right structures in place for you to be able to measure. And number two, why are you measuring it? Are you measuring it because you want to change things? Are you measuring it because you just want to know, understanding what you're trying to do? And then lastly, accountability. I feel like, am I still in the show? I think I
Yes,
am.
you are. Carry on.
Okay.
Yes, you are. Yeah.
So
Yes, you are.
I was wondering what happened to me.
Yes.
I think understanding the reason you want to measure. Secondly, being deliberate, so putting the structures in place to be able to make sure that this is incorporated in the day-to-day, if it's career development, if it's hiring, if it's in anything that you do as leaders, you've put that in place. And lastly, accountability, making sure, especially from the top, there's accountability on all these different things that we've put in place for it to happen. Because then if you're not measuring it for an accountability purpose, then I think just the way we are as human beings is it's not important. I
Yeah.
mean, if I'm not being
Yeah.
held accountable for it, then it's not
Yeah.
important. But if I have to be accountable to ensure that the number of people we are growing within our organizations have met our diversity, inclusion, um, um, metrics that we've put in the organization, then and that could mean a lot of things. It could be demographics. It could be, I mean, there's so many ways. There's so many tools you can use for this to
Yeah.
measure. It's very specific to whichever type of organization you want to work with. Could be gender,
Yeah.
whatever it is that you've put in place. Define that first. Understand why you want to change that which you want to change. And I think Benjamin already told us why we need this.
Mm.
And then put it in the structure. We have KPIs and we have to meet them, even individual KPIs. Every year
Yeah.
you set your goals for the year and you have to meet those goals. You have to be accountable to yourself and ask
Mm.
yourself, hey, it's March and I was telling myself I need to do ABCD. I haven't even started it. Will I
Yeah.
still meet my goal? We have
Yeah.
budgets. What are those? Making sure that you have those within an organization forces you, even if there's resistance to change. We go into organizations that we don't want to do specific things, but because it's a KPI, and then eventually you realize, or you want to build a product. I'll use Benjamin's example, and you think,
Mm.
why aren't these people appreciating what I'm trying to do? But now he understands better. It might be initial resistance at the beginning, but eventually they'll understand better. And so, as organizations, as leaders, you have to be deliberate around that. Hold people accountable, hold your organization accountable, hold yourself accountable to ensure that this is done within the organization. I think putting that in place will ensure that this is done.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sheila. I was just thinking about your earlier comment about how it's important to have data. And, you've really just reinforced that again when you've shared, what the ways forward are. And you've come back to this idea of data. It's important to know, what are we measuring? I know, for example, in Kenya, Safaricom looked at their supply chain and decided they wanted to diversify their supply chain because they felt that they were not sufficient women suppliers. And so they started by measuring, right? So, what is our current status? What is the data? And then they gave themselves some targets. And like you've said, Sheila, have KPIs around those targets. So you have leaders who are in different departments. Maybe, for example, in Safaricom, it would have been supply chain, who are being tasked with ensuring that they meet a particular percentage of the revenue generated be from particular or a certain percentage of procurement be from these diversified groups. So I agree with you 100%. You must start with the data. You must have a measure that you determine, and in your organization you can determine what that measure is, but then people must be accountable to that measure, because without accountability we're not really progressing anywhere. Thank you very much for sharing. Benjamin, I just want to come back to you. What are some examples of instances where equality might be intended, but to produce, a just outcome, but it doesn't? So the idea is we've implemented XYZ so that we have greater equality within a team, within an organization, but ultimately it backfires and it doesn't produce the outcome that we desire. Do you have any examples of something like that?
Again, let me use my work to sort of illustrate. So we do mentor matching. We find professionals and pair them with the young people in order for them to sort of learn and go easily negotiate that school to work transition process. And one of the interesting things is when you design these sorts of programs, you think you think of the beneficiary only in terms of what either you have experienced, or what, say for example, your partners and funders are willing to invest in, right? So there's a set there's in the entrepreneurship circles there's a joke that African founders are overtrained and underfunded. I don't know if it's something that you've heard before. So I think that, for example, that there are people for whom training or skilling is enough, right? That's all they need. But there are people for whom skilling itself is not enough. In fact, might be a waste of their time. Put like that. But so what some of our programs, so you have, let's say for example, the chances that a university student will struggle your typical university student will likely have a lot more access than someone who dropped out in, say, senior 2 in Uganda, which is, I think, is like grade 2.
Okay.
I don't know what grade it is. It's the post-primary grade in Kenya.
Form 2.
Maybe
yes,
Form 2?
Yes.
Form
So
2.
that someone in who goes to university will very likely have higher chance of access to resources, to whatever, than the one who is in Form 2, right? Who falls out in Form 2. Even if both of these people are, let's say, women, right? That their level of access will be totally different, right? But then you design this program that skills both of them, right, to survive in their context. But because of so that's essentially how we had approached some of our trainings. We said, okay, we'll run a skilling and mentorship program for, say, university students, but also we'll do another for out of school. Then we quickly realized that skilling out of school youth without giving them any sort of financial help is, like sort of is wasting both our time and their time, because they don't just need the skills. After training them, even as little as let's say 100 Kenya shillings, which, well, 1,000, maybe 1,000 Kenya shillings or 1,500 Kenya shillings, which is enough for them to put or start a business, is a lifeline for them, which isn't for, say, a university student, right? So then you say, okay, we have designed this program. Now we need to find money. We need to find someone that believes in the same thing, believes that skilling out of school young youth is not just enough, that you also need to give them some stipend, right? Well, not a stipend really, but capital, essentially, for them to go and start. That while we are sure that a university student can hustle here and there, speak to an uncle, borrow, pay back, speak to a parent, do this, has this, all of this access. These guys don't have the same networks, so you cannot treat them in the same way that you treat these others, right? The guys who have so that's one way. That's one example that I would give in terms of how we've approached things like this too. Like with that understanding that it can't be one size fit all if you're working around trying to achieve an outcome that is also equitable, right? And it's not just about equality. And another example that you will hear is quite often is people who work with young people saying they don't care, you set up trainings, they don't show up, they don't do this. But you never sit to think that your typical young person probably struggle to find a meal today. They don't have transport to come to the venue. They don't have internet to log on to a call like this. They are scared to admit it to themselves. They have all of these pressures and stuff. So if you're doing a program, for example, why are you running your program in like such a distance away from where they are? Why aren't you running your programs where they are, right? So, and we have this stuff. So we do things, we do what we call career clinics for university students to prepare them. But they are held in university for a reason, because that's where the students are. You can't require them to come to a hotel or to the boundless offices, because they don't have transport, they don't have all of this. So if you think about how do you design or how do you approach work, it's with that you have this in mind, that these people that I'm working with exist in this context. So I just sort of hope to grow them outside of their context. I have to go and exist in their context.
Yeah,
I
that makes
don't know if
sense.
that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And it goes back to the conversation we've been having about ensuring whatever interventions we have are based on an actual recognized need. So if we're saying we're implementing XYZ to ensure that we have greater equity, we need to make sure that that is actually the solution that is required. So we need to do a bit more due diligence to understand the target audience that we would like to provide a greater platform for. So in your example, if it's the youth, you have to understand the youth, so that you know exactly how your intervention can support them. Sheila, let me come back to you as we talk about this idea of equity. So the EQ Lunch and Learn is really designed to help us see how emotional intelligence is a thread that runs through everything that we do. So let's talk about emotional intelligence. How can emotional intelligence support leaders in implementing strategies for an inclusive and equitable workforce? What has EQ got to do with it?
EQ has probably everything to do with this, especially for leaders. I mentioned in the previous question around one of the around the challenges that you have in implementing this, or just generally for all of us as
Mhm.
humans, the culture and the environment we have. And
Yeah.
so, as a leader, if you're not able to connect, I think also Benjamin mentioning context. If you're not able to understand the context in which people are coming from, it is very difficult for you to even start imagining that you can provide something different for them. And so, EQ as a leader, it's the first thing, that awareness, that knowing I'm privileged, I have my own biases, but making sure that I am constantly checked on that as myself when I'm doing something is important. I think, secondly, it allows the leaders to be able to connect with the staff, with individuals outside of the organization, with partners, whoever it is, with that understanding of their context. That connection is important because it allows you to have uncomfortable conversations, but in a more
Mm,
way. In a, I am coming to you with just, I don't know, I need you to help me to understand. I need you to help me to see it from your eyes. I need you to help me as a leader. Saying that sometimes is very difficult. But EQ allows you to go to that level and say, let me understand where they're coming from, for me to put the right structures in place, for me to try to start putting measures around and targets around this that is important to these people, for me to give them a day off when they're celebrating something cultural that is important to them, as opposed to forcing them to work on those specific days. It might not be
mm,
a national holiday, but because it's important to this employee, it will make them more efficient, it will make them
mm,
feel seen, it will make them more productive. And that is
mm,
very important in creating an environment that allows other people beyond you as a leader to be able to also see others, or feel seen, but also see others within an organization. So I feel EQ is quite important in in leadership in general, in ensuring that we create inclusive culture in the organization, or make it a reality really in the organization. It starts small, and you can absolutely tell people, we are doing bad. Our pay gap is insane at the moment. We've checked data, but we are working towards it by doing A, B, C, D. That alone, I think, sometimes makes the biggest
Yeah.
difference. So I think creating an environment that um, allows the inclusive, equitable uh, workforce to thrive in it starts with the leader being there. Yeah.
I love that, Sheila. I agree with you 100%. One of the things I always say is that emotional intelligence is not another skill that you need to add to your plate as a leader. It is the plate upon which all other skills lie. Emotional intelligence fuels everything else because as you are able to connect with yourself, you are able to connect better with others and you are able to identify those biases. The reality is that if you have a brain, you have bias. We all have biases. And because biases are how the biases are born because the brain categorizes. The brain works by categorizing, and unfortunately, some of those categories that we put together in our minds can cause bias. And so, as you've rightly said, Sheila, when we are able to develop greater self-awareness and become aware of what our biases are, we are able to rectify those. So thank you very much for sharing. Before I come to you, Benjamin, let me just remind our audience, Wildest Dreams, great to have you here. Happy to see that you are enjoying the conversation. If you are online, say hello so that we can give you a shout out back, and feel free to type in any questions you may have for my panelists. If you have a question for a specific individual, you can indicate who it's for. Otherwise, just share your question and we will come to those next. Benjamin, let me come back to you. I want to talk about the idea of he for she. So, he for she is an invitation for men to stand in solidarity with women to create a bold, visible, and united force for gender equality. How can we ensure that the initiatives that we introduce at work actually bring men along? Because I think a lot of the times there can be this perception that it's an us versus them kind of environment. So, how do we make sure that men are part of the conversation around gender equality?
Um, the first thing that comes to mind is design the initiatives with the men, right? Because they are going to be a key part in seeing them come to life, or in frustrating and sabotaging them. So, uh, engaging them in this design process is really important, so that it becomes, it gives first of all, it gives a sense of understanding of what is it that we are doing and why are we doing it, right? Why is it important that we design these initiatives, right? But two, there's a sense of ownership, right? That because I was part of this process, and because I understand why it was designed in the way that it was designed, I want to see it succeed, or I want to see it work in some way. I don't want for us to have wasted our time. And let me use an illustration that's not exactly related to this, but it will still make the point. There's a TED talk. I don't remember what it's called. I think it's called Leadership Lessons from a Restaurant Owner or a hotel owner, something like that. So this guy essentially explains how his hotels went about the process of creating a cocktail menu, right? He said, look, we have a head of cocktails who we could have sat in an office and told, create for us all of these cocktails. Let's design a menu for all of them, right? That's because that's why he's paid. But instead, what did they do? They told each waiter in the hotel chain to create their own cocktail, right? So every waiter was given opportunity to create a cocktail of their own. And then those cocktails were put on the menu. So essentially every single waiter has a cocktail that they've created on the menu. So when you go in to order a cocktail, the waiter who's serving you is not recommending a cocktail that they know nothing about, or a cocktail that was made for them by the cocktail guy, or a meal that was done by the chef that they know nothing about. They never tasted. What he's doing is he's first recommending his cocktail to you, right? He's telling you, I designed this cocktail and I want you to have it. So there's this sense of ownership. But if you don't like it, he has 3, 4, 5, 6 others to recommend because he's tested all of them. He was part of the process of making them. So he tested his peers' cocktails. So he knows what they taste like. He knows how good they are. He knows which one is better. So if you tell him your preferences, it's easy for him to tell you like this, you won't like that.
Yeah.
And I think that in terms of designing these initiatives at work, to create, whether this united force around gender equality, it's a lot of what I see sometimes is that there's an us against them or us versus them, because for good reason, women's spaces are closed off to men. And so that design process doesn't always involve them. But I think if you're going to make this work and work fast enough, it's to also recognize that the context in which we exist means that you will interact with men in some way. So it might make sense to have them engaged in the co-creation process.
I like that. I think that's a really great response, Benjamin. This idea that, and I guess it's what we've been saying all along, right? That any intervention must involve everyone. And so if we are going to have men on board, then they need to be co-creators of some of the initiatives that we're rolling out. So we move away from it being us and them, and they take ownership. The data shows that, without men on board, we are not going to make any progress at all. And so it is critical when we're talking about gender specifically, that men are on board. And I think we can extrapolate that to say, when we talk about, ensuring that the youth are sitting at the table and taking up leadership roles, then we need to involve the youth in those discussions. And likewise, if we want to ensure that people with disability are also contributing to the decisions made, then they need to be part of the conversation. So thank you very much for sharing. So I'd like to, look at some of the questions that are coming through online from our participants. I have someone who's sent me a message saying that they're struggling to remain online. It looks like they're having connection issues, but they've sent a question which we've shared here. There's 2 questions one we've shared here. So one question is, what role can an employee, someone who's not a manager, play in promoting equity at the workplace? So I think we spoke about the fact that, a leader sets the tone earlier, but this question is, okay, maybe this person is not a leader. How can they ensure that there's equity in the workplace? So both of you can consider that as a question. Then we have another question, and this question is for leaders. And this question is, how do you balance meritocracy versus equitable recruiting? All right. So how do you balance meritocracy versus equitable recruiting? So those are the two questions. Question number one, what role can an employee, someone who's not a manager, play in promoting equity in the workplace? And question number two, how do you balance meritocracy versus equitable recruiting? So Sheila, Benjamin, anyone would like to answer, respond? Sheila, I saw you nodding to the second question about meritocracy and equitable recruiting. I don't know if you want to answer that one.
Yeah,
You responded to that. Please go ahead.
yeah. So I always find this question very interesting because one, it's a question that assumes that you cannot have merit based when you include inclusion. For most people, I'm not saying for this particular person, you can't. So when you're going into the hiring process, you already have a bias, and we've constantly mentioned bias and understanding your privileges. And so once you have those two things at the back of your mind, it is very critical for you as a leader to ensure that you put enough measures in place to reduce barriers that would amplify somebody else who's more privileged. For instance, I will come back to something that was mentioned earlier. If we are hiring for something that doesn't require university degree, why must we put a university degree as a criteria for this role? It means automatically I have removed everybody else who might actually be skilled enough and competent enough to do this job by putting this criteria. So sometimes we limit merit because of the criteria we put in place that then pushes people out of that stair that you've already put. So I think as a leader, you have to ensure that first you understand that um, when you're hiring, there are things, nuances that I was talking about behavioral hiring, nuances that sometimes we don't consider that limits us from getting good candidates. And I'll give you an example, the situation we're in right now with COVID. If I was hiring for an international organization and someone was supposed to come to a session and then there was demonstration yesterday in Kenya and they're supposed to go to a cyber and they don't make it, if I don't allow them to write to me and say, oh, I have got these issues yesterday, I was not able to get to the cyber for me to attend the interview, and I still give them an opportunity to re-interview, I have locked out this particular person automatically because I don't understand where they are coming from. So as a leader, I think it's very, 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 very critical to understand those biases and reduce as many barriers as possible for anyone who has merits to be able to access the job, regardless of this other thing. That's number one. Number two, you have to put measures. Remember, we'll come back to this data thing. I will constantly talk about that. We have to put those measures in place for us to be able to have as many diverse people as possible in our team. Back to the human-centered design approach, the more voices we have in the room, the better products we will have, the better engagement we will have, the better use cases we will have. Same thing for your team. Ensure that whatever you do, because then if you just want one type of people, one type of demographic, one type of, you really lock yourself out of so many other good things that come with different people that would come into your team. So after you've reduced the barrier, ensure that staircases we talk about in that picture that you normally have for equity, inclusion, equity and equality, ensure that you create those staircases so that everybody has First of all, the first reducing barrier is equity, and then increasing the staircases, you ensure that there's no equality and then equity. So ensure
Yeah.
that you also put that in place. I think you will not look at it as a merit issue, and even if it is, and you have measures in place to build their skills internally, because you're creating a more diverse team, it's absolutely
Mm,
fine. It will pay you in the long run when you do that.
mm, mm. I like what you said, Sheila, and I think that the critical piece for me as a leader is to ask yourself, what is your ultimate objective? When you recognize that having a diverse workforce, so for example, if you have a team of staff that's older, perhaps in leadership, and you recognize that you want to bring a youthful perspective to the leadership table, then bringing that youth on board, even if it does mean that you must supplement their skills. So even if it means they need additional training, you're seeing it as a win in the long run because they are bringing that diverse voice. And so you're not seeing it as this idea that they don't deserve it, right? It's not on merit. It is on merit because the very fact of their youth is what they're bringing to the table. I really like that. I think that's a really nice way to look at something. Benjamin, there's a question that's specifically for you. We still haven't answered the other question about the role an employee can play. But there's another question that's specifically for you, Benjamin. So you may want to answer this one. And then if you would like, you can go back to the other question as well. So the question for Benjamin, how can men more intentionally become a he for she, especially at the workplace? So how can men become more intentionally a he for she at work?
Um, my answer, I think, sort of encompasses all the three questions that we received, and I think when I think about all of this conversation, I also feel that like most issues that have to do with social justice, right? That they are a journey that you must take, uh, while also recognizing that you might not be around to see the destination, or you might not sometimes even know what destination is, but you know that it's important for you to take this journey. And I feel the same way about this conversation around equity, especially. So my team, I have a team of 7 people, colleagues here at work, but 5 of them are women. There's only 2 men, myself and another colleague, and but also the age ranges are sort of like it's a mix. Um, And one of the questions that I usually get, no, actually, when people ask me about my team, the question is, why do you have so many women on your team? Why is your team entirely women? How do you manage to work with women? Like how like is it easy for you to work with women and stuff like that? So I'm sort of used to those kinds of questions, and I know how to respond to them. Until last month, a woman actually asked me a very interesting question that I had never had before. So she texts me. She had come to speak to give a talk at one of our events, and then she texts me the next day and says, I want to ask you something about your team." I say, "Yeah, yeah, I know what you're going to ask." And I have a response. I said, "Yeah, yeah." Just why is your team predominantly from one region of the country? It's it's not something I had ever thought about, uh, noticed, or maybe I had, and then, but it's not a
Mm,
question. But you see, someone had gone beyond why is your team full of women to
women.
why is your team from one region. And I think that when you think about this in terms of a journey, is that at least I am happy that we've crossed one level where the question of whether women are competent or not is not something that we grapple with. That's been answered by the quality of our work. But now someone says it's not equitable enough, right? You have to have people from other regions. So that's next step, right?
Next step. Yeah.
And I think that example for me illustrates that there's usually no end because the nuances, I think someone talked about nuances. The nuances keep getting redefined and changing, and contexts keep changing. So if we do the regional, if we do achieve the regional balance thing, someone might say, the edge, why don't you have older people, like much older people on your team and stuff like that? So it's really such you have to continue, you have to keep being responsive and conscious of what's going on around you if you're going to achieve this. So that's how I will answer this question. So for both in terms of how you can both achieve meritocracy and equitable recruiting, that you don't have to arrive today. You don't have to have the answers today. You have to be intentional about it. But this is also something that, as an employee and an employer, as a colleague, you must be conscious about. So it's not just about results, it's also about what are we doing to be able to achieve this, and how can we improve ourselves. So even as an employee, just thinking about how to move this conversation and contribute to the conversation around equity, it's to make your case for why it's important, right? And not try to push things through today, because there's also context that you have as an employee that your employer doesn't have sometimes. So are you working at getting them to understand why equity is important, right? As a man in the organization, are you conscious about this? Are you having conversations that about the consciousness and the importance of these issues? And if there's that deliberateness, and because this is a journey again, not everyone needs to be at the same level, right? The same. My friends who are builders in the feminist circles like to say that all of us arrive at our liberation, if you like, at different points, right? There's no single day when it clicks for everyone and all of us are at the same level. The important thing is that consciousness to know that where we are today is not where we must be, and putting in the work to make sure that you grow. And it's pretty much the same thing for everyone. That constant intentionality to grow and develop yourself and be better than you were yesterday is something that if all of us work at, some of these issues become easier to tackle.
Yeah.
I don't know which of the questions I've answered, but I felt
That's cool. That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Benjamin. I like what you said, this idea that it's a journey we're on, and we must be committed to continuing to make or take that journey. And I think in response to the question that was asked specifically to Benjamin, how can men be more intentional? I think it starts, as Benjamin says, with having that awareness of the biases that we have, and then making that effort on a regular basis to continue growing. Sheila, there's another question here. How can managers offer equal opportunities to people of all different backgrounds? So how can you make sure as a manager you're not biased? Benjamin talked about the fact that someone asked him, how is it that all the ladies are from the same part of the country? So how do you make sure that when you are promoting, when you are giving assignments, when you are sending people for training, that it's equitable?
Mm. I think start with the knowns. Look at your team. How is my team? How many women do I have? How many men do I have? Which backgrounds do they come from? Understand what you have first. And then after you understand what you have, then you are able to change what you don't have. Because then you will notice, I mean, like for instance, now Benjamin knows maybe he needs to hire from a different region, right? He wouldn't
Yeah.
have thought of that if he did know that. Yeah. So
Mm,
as a manager, first start from what you have as a team. Um, it could be like, for instance, your work is in one region. You have to speak in the local language. I mean, it's not
mm,
possible
mm,
for you to
mm,
hire from a different region. Like understand what is it that you're trying to do and what would you require for you to be able to deliver that which you're trying to do. And then once you put that data, now use that to say, okay, in our team, we don't have this, that, and the other. Then now put those in place. And reduce the barriers. Again, reduce the barriers. If you feel this thing can be done without this criteria we put here, that honestly, it's I have to know algebra for work that I don't need to know algebra. Remove it. Like, why do you need to put that in the criteria? Just remove it. It's just so simple.
mm,
Remove that
mm,
which is not going to allow you to deliver. If it does not require me delivering anything in person, or why must I come to the office in person? Unless there's a very specific, maybe for specific team days, whatever it is, right? So ensure
mm,
that you reduce as many barriers as possible for people you're trying to hire. And then remember you're human and you're hiring humans. Please, as a
mm,
manager, never forget that. There are things that happen to us as human beings on a daily. Do not forget that anytime you're talking to someone, if they are nervous, don't try to make them more nervous. Try
mm,
to be human to them. Just say, do you need a minute to breathe? Is it okay? If you see they are fumbling in their questions, lead them. I don't get why
mm,
you're like, oh, now they are fumbling. I don't need. If you feel you can get better answers from them, you might lose someone because in that particular moment they're a bit more nervous or they've forgotten something or there are people whose thoughts
mm,
are all over the place. Try to direct them to come back to the point that you're trying to ask. Guide them. Be human when you're
mm,
hiring. Just try to put yourself in that interviewee's point, or a staff, they're struggling. Go and talk to them. What is it that you're going through? Is everything fine? Is there anything I can do for you as your manager? Now I'm talking to you as your friend. Tell me, is there anything you'd require? Do you require more trainings? Do you require, okay, maybe it's a man, you don't have leave days or maternity, or what are they called? Paternity leaves for them. And they're struggling because maybe the wife had a CS and she's alone at home and they can't focus at work. Give them off. Let them go home. Like, just be human at the end of the day. There are structures you need to put in an organization, but there's also humanity that you have to have as a manager on a daily basis. I think that allows you to be able to have the right structures, better recruitment process, better employee skill development process, leadership skill development processes, and tools in place to ensure that those things happen within your organization. I feel that is critical for managers. Yeah.
Wow, thank you very much, Sheila. I love what you've said. I think this is really, really great insights. And thank you very much for your question. I hope that you feel answered. Minkrasi, great to have you online. We've got a comment here. Self-awareness is key so as to overcome your own biases and be able to make the team diverse and avoid tokenism. Sometimes we don't even know we have these biases. I think that as a manager, it's critical to interrogate yourself to determine what biases you have. And we always think of biases as the big things like, I have biases, from a gender perspective. So you tell yourself, no, I'm not biased because I hire men as well as women, or women as well as men. But, biases, there are so many other biases. I have an example I was given in a forum that I was in recently, where you have an individual who has come from a very, very poor background, and they literally had to pull themselves up to where they are. So everything they've ever done has been through hard work and sweat. They were not able to have school fees paid for them past a certain point, so they had to do extra jobs to finish even Form 4, which is where you graduate from high school. To go to university, they had to take a break to save up the money to go. And finally, this person has graduated and they have grown in their career and they are now a manager. As they are working with their team, there's this member in their team who comes from a privileged background. And every time they look at this individual, they feel as though this person has never worked hard in their life. They were to the best schools. They were given a car to drive. They live in a nice area, probably never know anything about paying bills and rent. And so you could have a bias against an individual like that because of your upbringing. And you don't realize that you are not giving them good assignments. You're sending them for all the tough assignments. You are not giving them opportunities to grow because in your mind, this person has never worked in their life. And yet that could be a perception you have. This individual could be just as hardworking, even though they've come from a privileged background. And so I think, this idea, I mean, Krasi, of self-awareness is critical, which is why, to Sheila's earlier point, emotional intelligence is critical. Emotional intelligence is important because it helps us as leaders to see where these biases may lie. We're talking about embracing equity, and because it's International Women's Day month, our focus could be on gender, but we have biases that are beyond gender, and we need to be aware of them. Fantastic. Our time has fast spent. I always am amazed at how quickly this time goes. Sheila, Benjamin, allow me to ask you for your parting shots as we close. Benjamin, what is your final reflection? And then Sheila will come to you for your final reflection as we close up. You're muted, Benjamin. You did not. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe just to say that I think that, like many things, there needs to be the highest motivation for us should be like the individual must do the work, because systems are individuals first. They are a collective, right? So if, for example, for us to build the systems that we have built internally as an organization, as a movement or whatever, it's because there's people who put in the work to get better at what they can every single day. Uh, they are not perfect. They will have their problems, but the willingness to try, to want to get better is very, very important. So I would say that it's really, really important that individuals are conscious and put in the work and recognize why these things are important, uh, why diversity is important, why equity is important, why access, why opportunity is important for everyone, but also um, why there's more to gain than lose when we build systems around this sort of stuff, because then it becomes easy. If there are systems, you have lots more guarantees that this will work beyond the individual. So some of the challenges that we face, because we are exerting pressure on a system where individuals haven't done the work, don't do the work,
Yeah.
to push on and build the that fabric that's required for the system to respond as it should. So I would encourage, whether it's managers on a call, or you know employees, or business people, to just think about what am I doing to get better myself, to be conscious, to notice these things. And even if you don't notice them, it's also okay. I think that on this journey, um, intention is just the first step, and if we
Mm,
can get
mm,
that right, then
mm.
we can move to the next step. So if we put in the work to build
Yeah,
intentionality,
yeah.
I'll be happy.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Benjamin. So individuals must I like the point you made or the statement you said about how sometimes we're putting pressure on systems, but the individuals haven't done the work. I think that's profound. The individuals must do the work. We must take responsibility for our own biases and awareness of our biases. Sheila, your parting shot?
I think it's good to have biases. It's just bad when we are defensive about it, and
Mm,
we don't block those biases from allowing us to see the other person's perspective, because we cannot run away from having those biases. So don't be defensive about it. As a leader, first step is to understand that yes, I have biases, but I also have a responsibility to ensure that individuals within my team, individuals within this organization, have equal opportunity, that my team is diverse, that there's inclusive environment for the team to be able in the workforce to thrive. There's opportunity that can be accessed by everyone, and I've reduced all potential barriers for anyone to be able to access this. And at all times, I'm aware as a leader that finding the right connections, and human connections, I don't mean networks, social capital, no, human connection and interaction, is critical
mm,
in creating this environment of inclusiveness, creating environment where people are okay with others being different, creating an
mm,
environment where everyone feels seen. I think
mm.
it's quite important. Even when
Yeah.
you're not hiring someone, give them feedback. Tell them, we
Mm,
did not hire you because of ABCD, so that they can improve themselves. If you're letting someone go, let them go in a dignified manner. I think that
mm.
is very, very important. And
Yeah.
I think that changes us as individuals, where it all starts as individuals. So if we are, I don't want to say kind to each other, but if we are kind, if we are kind
Yeah.
to each other, as
Yeah.
leaders, as individuals, it makes the
Mm,
biggest change in
mm,
ensuring that this happen. Just even when someone doesn't understand something, don't be mad at them. Or how come you don't know? They,
mm,
they just don't know. Try
mm,
to explain to them, I am coming
mm,
from this context, and you're not
mm,
seeing it from my point. And if they are also conscious enough to see, oh, okay, I get why I was not getting your point, I think it will create a
mm.
better environment for us to have this, you know, equitable, inclusive, and diverse environments we can work with, and people to work with.
I love it. Thank you very much, Sheila, for that parting shot. And I can just, as we begin to close, share my key takeaways from our conversation. It really has been a rich conversation, and it always is a rich conversation on these EQ Lunch and Learns. As I always promise, if you bring your lunch, we will bring the learning. I think Sheila kicked us off earlier with a point that one of the biggest challenges that we're facing in organizations is a resistance, and that resistance is often rooted in our society, our culture and upbringing. And so this brings us to the last point that both have made, that individuals must do the work. We must ask ourselves, what in my culture and upbringing is showing up as a possible bias, and how can I begin to do the individual work, as Benjamin said, in order to navigate those biases. The reality is that we are all biased. It is the way the brain categorizes data that causes bias. And so that's something that, as long as you have a brain, you have bias, but we can do something about it. And emotional intelligence is critical because it helps us to practice self awareness. I think another takeaway is the idea that if we are going to implement equity in ways that works, we must collect data to back up the process. We must make sure that our initiatives are data driven. And I think my last takeaway is the idea that we need to bring everyone along. So when it comes to gender, we need to make sure that men are a critical part of finding the solution so that everyone moves together. As the African proverb said, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. Thank you so much, Benjamin. Thank you so much, Sheila. This has been a really, really awesome conversation. Stay with me as we wrap up. Allow me to just give you an insight into our topic for next month. Next month, as we gear up for the EQ for Africa conference, which is in May, we will be talking about mental health. Our EQ for Africa conference is the mental health edition, and it runs on the 19th of May in Nairobi. And as we prepare for that, in the month of April, our EQ Lunch and Learn is going to be unpacking mental health, leveraging the facilitators who will be part of the conference. So allow me, I know we've gone a little over time, but allow me to share a little bit about the conference. Our mental health affects how we think and feel about ourselves and others, how we interpret events, how we learn, how we cope with life events, and how we develop and sustain relationships at work. Mental health, along with emotional, physical health, and social well-being, is an essential component of overall health. Your mental well-being, which is a combination of how you feel and how you function, is critical for your success at work and your ability to achieve your career goals. So join us on Friday, the 19th of May, for the annual EQ for Africa conference. This will be the mental health breakfast edition, running from 7 a.m. to 11, to learn actionable strategies that you can utilize to strengthen mental well-being and maintain balance, and learn how you can use emotional intelligence to build greater resilience. Find out more about the EQ for Africa conference on our website, www.eqforafrica.com. We've shared the link in the comments. We would love to have you part of this very important and yet often overlooked conversation. So, the last Wednesday of every month, we are here with our EQ Lunch and Learn. Next month, as I mentioned, we're talking about mental health in preparation for the EQ for Africa conference, which will be on the 19th of May. Thank you very much for joining us today. I trust that you have benefited from the conversations and you've taken away something important. Allow me to appreciate our guests and say goodbye to them. Thank you very much, Sheila, for joining us. It has been great having you online. Thank you very much, Benjamin, for joining us. We've really enjoyed your insights. I know that they have dropped some great learning, and we have now come to the end of our event. Thank you very much for joining us. As always, don't forget to diarize the last Wednesday of every month for our EQ Lunch and Learn. Looking forward to being with you next time as we talk about the EQ for Africa conference and your mental health. Goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of